All right, I'm going to get us started. Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining us. My name's Susanna Baruch. I'm the Executive Director of the Petrie-Flom Center for Health Law Policy, Biotechnology, and Bioethics. There will be a drawing in a few moments for a free copy of Eric Klinenberg's book. This is the beautiful new paperback edition. This is the first time we've done a giveaway like this, I think. Today is a special day for Petrie-Flom. It is the first event of our 20th anniversary year. And it's maybe only fitting that it's a moment in our nation and our world that feels sort of dizzying and uncertain in health law and otherwise. But we thought that it might help to consider in a sort of interdisciplinary way all that has happened in the last 5 years and everything that we've, unless you're under 5 years old, which doesn't look like, all that we've been through together. So that's the goal for today. So I'm going to do quick introductions before turning the mic over to our moderator. Our special guest is Eric Klinenberg. He is the Helen Gould Shepard Professor in the Social Sciences and Director of the Institute for Public Knowledge at New York University. He is the author of this remarkable book and many others. I wanted to let you know that we have some more special events coming up during our anniversary year. Tomorrow we'll be holding a half-day conference on psychedelics, law, and spirituality. In a few weeks we'll have a virtual event, an online webinar on ethics and the law and regulation of medical AI. Our annual conference this year is on law, healthcare, and the aging brain and body. We will do a second summer boot camp for rising thought leaders on psychedelics, law, medicine, research, and regulations. And please keep an eye out for a special September gathering in the fall to mark our 20th anniversary that will include both a party and a chance to hear from some of the people who've come through Petrie-Flom over the years. So I am delighted that our esteemed moderator today is HLS's own John H. Watson Jr., Professor of Law, Jeannie Gersen. We also have Petrie-Flom's own former senior fellow, Dr. Rochelle Walensky, who of course also served as the 19th director of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention during some of the toughest times in the COVID-19 pandemic. And we have Petrie-Flom's own faculty director, Glenn Cohen, who is also the James A. Atwood and Leslie Williams Professor of Law and Deputy Dean here at Harvard Law School. I'm almost done. It's almost time for the drawing. But I do want to thank the Oswald D.N. Kamen Fund at Harvard University. We are co-sponsored by the Harvard Medical School's Center for Bioethics, the Chan School of Public Health, the Center for Labor and a Just Economy at Harvard Law School, Harvard Health Law Society, the Edmund and Lily Safra Center for Ethics, and the Center for Health Law and Policy Innovation here at HLS, and their clinics, the Health Law and Policy Clinic and Food Law and Policy Clinic. As in the words of Bertolt Brecht, everybody needs help from everyone, and we are grateful for all of this support. With that, I'm going to very quickly read aloud 5 numbers. If you are a winner, you can collect your book on your way out. I have them in a little a tin. Anyone who wants to inspect it can. The numbers are 079006, 079007, 079005, and 079022. That's only 4. And the 5th, 079034. We'll have these numbers also posted in case you didn't hear me or you forget. So with that, I'm going to invite all our guests to come up and turn this over to Professor Gersen.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Thank you to the Petrie-Flom Center, and I'm so grateful that we can all gather here today to discuss Eric Klinenberg's book and to be joined in the discussion by Rochelle Walensky, and Glenn Cohen. I am the moderator, and I just want to start just very briefly by remarking on the fact that 2020 was a year when we weren't gathered together for a lot of it. And as soon as it was over, we pretty much wanted it to be in the rearview mirror. And so a lot of us really never talked about it very much, even though during it, it was obviously a crisis. And so now we're in 2025, and lots of people are feeling like it's a crisis or about to become one. And so I think that it's very fitting that we're having this event about 2020 and with Eric Klinenberg, who really embodies the model of a scholar, a journalist, and a humane writer who captures the stories of people and societies like no one else. So I'm very pleased to introduce my friend Eric, and then so pleased that we will be having commentary by Rochelle Walensky and Glenn Cohen. And so why don't we just turn it over to Eric?
Do you mind if I go up there?
You can, yeah.
Make sure we have a microphone for you. Is there a mic? Yeah. Cool. That's fine. Great. Is this working okay? Can you hear me? Thank you for the nice introduction. It's really an honor for me to be here. Can't wait to really engage in the conversation. And so I'm going to speak for just about 15 minutes and hope that really this event is about engaging with each other. And Jeannie, you're right to say that being with each other physically and being able to process difficult things, contentious problems, is so essential and fundamental and truly missing from what happened in this country and in many other parts of the world after 2020. In fact, I'm a sociologist by training, and what I would say about our collective response to what happened here that year has been marked by a will not to know what happened. It's almost as if it's too painful to go back there. And that makes sense at a human level. If you go back and think about what the experience of 2020 was like for so many of us, it involved confronting questions about our mortality. It involved feeling uncertain about what would happen to our parents or our grandparents or our children. The book opens with an account of a medical doctor who was on a fellowship in the beginning of the pandemic. His wife was getting over cancer treatments, was severely immunocompromised, and he said, the thing that was so powerful to me about the beginning of the pandemic is that it changed the meaning of breathing. He said, if you think about it, when you breathe, it's the most fundamental exchange we have, not with each other, but with the world. You breathe in and you take in the place where you are, and you breathe out and you give something back, you become part of the system. It's necessary for life, and yet there was a way in which, in the beginning of the pandemic and throughout this time, the thing that's most fundamental to our survival, this very basic act, became also the thing that was most likely to kill us. And in a way, that kind of reality has made it difficult for us to process this. So there's a lot in this book, which is an account that shifts between a series of analytic questions about why our experience here came out the way it did. It focuses specifically on why the United States fared so much worse than it seemed poised to do. In the beginning of the pandemic, some of you will know that when groups of experts assessed the varying capacities of different nations on Earth to respond to a pandemic, before 2020, the U.S. was rated the best prepared for a pandemic. Second was the U.K. And in fact, in 2020 and 21, the U.S. fared far worse than the countries we like to compare ourselves to, especially on mortality, excess mortality, but in many other dimensions as well. So there's a series of analytic questions about things like that, about masks, about trust, about why some people and places were affected more than others. And there's also a series of chapters that are about individual people. The book's called 2020, One City, 7 People, the Year Everything Changed. And I have kind of long profiles of 7 very different people, one from each borough of New York City, plus someone who died early in the pandemic working in the MTA system as a custodian. And the person who's on the cover of the book was someone who got very involved in the Black Lives Matter protests. And for him, 2020 was about this movement for racial justice. So the book alternates between those things. And I obviously am not going to cover that in the 10 minutes I have left. So I thought I'd really kind of hone in on one topic that might be of interest for us today. The problem of trust and distrust, and what it means for us to live in a society where distrust is now the default. And I say this on a day where we've just voted in a new secretary of HHS. We have new health leadership in this country. And he's most famous for his distrust of the medical science establishment around a tool for public health that has been vitally important, vaccines. But of course, that's not the only thing. When I came here today, I pick up the newspaper, but the reality is no one picks up the newspaper anymore. So I felt like if I went on some local websites to see what was happening around health, and I noticed a recent story calling attention to an outbreak of avian influenza among birds here in the state of Massachusetts. And many of you probably have noted that there's been outbreaks among cattle and some cases of human beings who've caught avian influenza on dairy farms. And while there's not really great reason to think that avian flu is an imminent threat, today, for those of us who are here, we're not wearing masks for the most part. We're not concerned like we're on COVID. A lot of people who work around public health are concerned about what could happen tomorrow or next month or who knows when with so much avian flu around. You probably also know that recently it's become clear that the MMWR, one of the key publications from the CDC, decided not to publish 2 articles about avian influenza, which makes it very difficult for us to track what's happening. And I think one of the issues around trust and distrust that we need to talk more about is we're living in a different information environment, and I think there are growing concerns that vital statistics that we need to make sense of who we are and what's happening, what might happen next, are becoming harder to trust and control. And there's a whole conversation to have about what this means for us moving forward. This popped up in COVID. A lot of people think about the partisanship around the COVID debate, which makes a lot of sense, but it doesn't really matter whether you're on Team Red or Team Blue to know that in 2020, when people's lives were on the line, statistics became very political. And people on both sides of the aisle were found to be manipulating data. So lots of conversations you've had about what happened in the White House, but in New York, where I live, the governor became a kind of national hero for speaking up, speaking back, critically engaging the president around questions of how to govern through public health. But Governor Cuomo, who's returning to New York's political life now, also actively worked to suppress data on who was dying in nursing homes, right? And there were similar accusations made against Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida. So one of the problems of the moment we're in right now is that basic numbers that come from federal agencies, much of the time, but can come from state agencies as well, are essential for us to make sense of the moment, and increasingly it's hard for us to assess how reliable they are. And this is something we need to pay attention to and understand. One of my emerging concerns as we head into who knows what situation with avian influenza or whatever the next infectious disease or health problem or climate transformation might be, it's hard to know how much we can trust the data. That's not the only matter of trust that I've tried to pay attention to in the book. I want to return your attention to one of many things that happened that was kind of so many things happened so fast in the year 2020. I think it's been hard for us to grab them all and pay attention. So do you remember in the very beginning of the pandemic when we didn't really understand what COVID was? We didn't know who was at risk. We didn't have medication. We didn't know how to treat it. There was no vaccine. And the government here, like governments around the world, said, the situation is so dire, we would like you to stay home. We want you not to go to work. We're going to close your offices. We'd like you not to go to school. We're closing your schools. No gyms, no restaurants, no bars, no parks, no playgrounds. Do you remember this? This we remember, right? It was an incredible lockdown. But there was one group of people, we said, there's one group of people that's so important to our health and welfare that we are going to make an exception for them, right? There's a category that came kind of out of nowhere for most of us. Do you remember this category? There's a special group of people. Remember what we called them? Essential workers, right? Essential workers. You're so important. What you do, the labor you do, we need it to survive. Just quick show of hands. How many of you have been talking a lot about essential workers recently? Okay. So nobody. So as a sociologist, one of the reasons I like to write about crises is because my theory of crises is that when you have an extreme event, you get all kinds of insights. You can see something fundamental about who we are and what we value and whose lives matter. And here's a thing I just want to call attention to. So crises reveal things. That says that on the poster for this event. So what did this reveal? It said to us, some workers are essential and deserve to be out in the workforce. Now, I live in New York City, and so when we say essential workers, you think, I know who the essential workers are in New York City. They're the finance guys, right? Just because I'm here at the Harvard Law School, I'll say they're the white shoe law firm workers, right? Like if you look at the labor market, those are the essential people, right? The Knicks, maybe. Definitely the Celtics. But remember, they shut down the NBA. And it certainly wasn't the finance guys, and I'm sorry, not the law people either. When push came to shove and life was on the line, who did we see? Who did we call out as essential workers? They were the people who were custodians. They were people who were clerks. They were people who worked in hospitals, right? Not just the doctors, but the nurses and the janitors and the people who worked in the kitchens. Right? They were our delivery people. They were agricultural laborers, right? People who worked in meatpacking plants, right? And the thing is, when we said you're essential, we basically sent them out into the world when we had no capacity to prevent them from getting the disease. A lot of institutions didn't have access to PPE at the time. So they wound up having much higher incidence of COVID. And of course, those workers weren't just coming home to empty apartments, they were typically coming home to their families, which meant the people who lived in their homes also had a higher incidence of COVID and significantly higher mortality rates, right? And you would think that in a society where you say some people are essential, that when you call out an open secret like that, when you say it, there's a moral obligation. Maybe there would have been a legal obligation in some societies. You will get special access to health. You get the best health care. You will get compensation. You will get a bonus. At least you will get respect and recognition. But in the United States, to be called essential was to be deemed expendable. To be called essential was to be deemed expendable. And the sense of betrayal that people who took those jobs, went out into the world, brought COVID into their bodies and into their families, and experienced more pain and suffering and death for that, I think have every reason to feel distrustful, not just of one president or one governor, but of all of us, for being so quick to forget that happened and to move on. So quick to do that. And I find that puzzling and a problem. In the year 2024, when this book came out, I went around the country and I kept saying, we're still in this. situation. We're still suffering from long COVID as a kind of social condition. For some, long COVID is a real medical condition, but it's also a social condition. I think it's back now. And because we have this will not to know, because we're in such denial, we're in such a rush to move on, we're forgetting what it was like to live through that dysfunction, that dysregulation. We're forgetting about the debts we incurred. We're forgetting about the danger and precarity of the moment. And I also said at the time, I think there's one candidate for office who's going to benefit for that more than anyone else, right? And I think that's what's happened. I think we've just had this will to move on, and we shouldn't. The distrust has deeper sources, in other words, than just being worried about governors manipulating data or government agencies manipulating data. And I'll tell you one more story before I close from one of the profiles. I have these 7 different people in New York who I followed through the year of 2020, and they come from all walks of life. There's a story about a woman named Enuma Menketti. It's a black woman who lives in Brooklyn who is married to a corrections officer who worked on Rikers Island. And I won't say much about her, but their story is really heartbreaking for me. They had very young kids, and one moment in the story is that they were part of a community daycare program, a home daycare program, and it was one that was organized around principles of progressivism and tolerance and decency with a real emphasis on racial justice issues. And it talked a good game. And when the pandemic started, it closed down, as many daycare facilities did. There's a section in the book about what happened to inside of American families, which can be summed up by the idea that in most societies like ours, they have welfare states to take care of those things. In the United States, we have women. And so there's enormous pressure on mothers to deal with that. But it turned out at some point the daycare reopened, but no one called Enuma's family to tell them. And they only found out months later when they bumped into somebody who was in the daycare. And they learned that the daycare facility didn't want their family coming back because Enuma's husband working at Rikers Island represented a healthcare risk for the rest of them. And so they simply didn't communicate that information. And the family was left out. So a lot of our best local institutions, and maybe many of us, kind of failed to live up to our own principles. Yeah. And that's something that deserves reckoning. But for me, the most profound encounter that I want to share with you before I end has to do with a person who's very different from me, with a very different value system. There's a guy I write about at length named Danny Presti, who is a bar manager in Staten Island. And Staten Island is the whitest borough in New York City. It's the most politically conservative borough in New York City. And when the pandemic started, Presti and a buddy of his had been trying to open up a new bar. They waited months to get their liquor license, couldn't get an answer from the New York Liquor Authority about whether they could get the license. They finally did in late 2019. They opened up the bar, and a few months later they were closed. And Presti said he wasn't a particularly political person when the pandemic started. He didn't really want to get involved in TV news at the bar. He wanted there to be sports. There was a place you could go, after your softball game. He was worried about the sense of isolation. People were cut off from each other. He thought a bar could be a great community institution. And he wanted it for social reasons. Of course, it was shut down quickly. And one of the problems that he and his partner had is that as a new business, they struggled to get access to COVID relief funds. The stimulus checks weren't really designed for people like him, and he saw a lot of the big companies around him getting bailed out. And for him, there was just a high level of uncertainty. Like, what will happen next? Will I be able to afford to feed my family? What's going to happen to this investment? Are we going to have to shut down? And he flipped through all the cycles of opening and closing down, tried to get answers from local officials about when he'd be able to run his business, didn't feel like anyone really treated him with respect or dignity, couldn't give him a straight answer, would not even answer, expected him to make the sacrifice in the name of public health. And at some point, he and his friend decided, we've had enough, we can't do this anymore. And they got in touch. That his story is that he got radicalized on the right over the course of 2020. He felt like The people who were concerned about public health weren't concerned about his private well-being or the well-being of people in his community, that they were being unsympathetic to the economic hardships that the closures entailed. And he didn't feel like he was getting an audience for that. And I don't feel a lot of affinity for his politics, but it was really important for me to try to understand where he was coming from and what motivated him. So over the course of the year, he wound up listening to more and more right-wing media, being more and more attracted to the ideas he was hearing. And at some point, he and his friend, the business owner, got in touch with a political provocateur, and they decided to call attention to their cause. They would declare their bar an autonomous zone, which I never went to Harvard Law School, but I think you can't do that. I'm pretty sure you can't do that. But they declared the bar an autonomous zone, and they invited people to come. And people came, thousands came, including the Proud Boys and a lot of extreme right-wing groups who rallied in Staten Island for a reopening. And in fact, that's how I first heard about Daniel Presti, is I was so angry when I read it on Twitter that I wanted to scream, but then I decided, like, when you're a sociologist, actually studying it is better than screaming. So I did that. And what followed is this kind of incredible account that he gave to me about how he came to feel betrayed by political officials who wouldn't take him and his concerns seriously. He wound up getting arrested. There's a lot of drama around what happened with his closure, but really what happened is that he found himself increasingly attracted to people who promised him unfettered freedom, who promised him the chance to do business, who told him that there was a repressive state that was trying to hold him down. He became, in his own words, a freedom fighter. And I'm sharing this story because he wasn't an anomaly during that time. And when I talk about long COVID as a social condition, I think there are a lot of Americans who got primed for this kind of radicalization during 2020, with their frustration with the way that we've handled it. And what's happened in subsequent years is that sentiment has been activated and weaponized and integrated into the mainstream of our politics, such that today, the people who are among the most fierce critics of the most conventional approaches to things like public health are now in charge of the whole thing. I'm eager for our conversation today because I'm looking for a way to engage this moment. I'll tell you, as a social scientist who's dedicated his career to evidence and reason and analysis, I find it hard to know what's going to move the needle in our public life at a moment like this. But I think we have to do it after processing what we've lived through together. And if there's one thing I've learned from this experience, it's that repressing all of this experience is a formula for disaster. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Rochelle?
Oh, great. That's going to be hard to follow. Thank you. First of all, thank you to Petrie-Flom and Glenn and Susanna for the opportunity to be here and to be back. I also want to thank Eric for a trip down memory lane, which was actually a difficult road for me to read. I knew that this was going to be hard, and it was. It was really hard for me to read this book. I will say the opening prologue, I think, speaks about uncertainty, and that was exactly where I knew that I would be captured. I'm an infectious disease trained clinician, but I'm a decision scientist by mathematical training, methods training, and in decision science, the second chapter of the textbook is called Managing Uncertainty. And the reason they call it that is because most of society doesn't know what to do with uncertainty and doesn't know what to do with risk. And that was what we were handling and what we were dealing with in March, I will say March 6th, which was the day my pager went off. And that was the day that we had our first 2 cases in Massachusetts for the Biogen outbreak 5 years ago. I loved reading the book and its structure, both weaving in the individual stories, the deep individual stories, and the sort of the institutions and frameworks like trust, like youth, like racism, like community and education that sort of were in between the individual stories. Maybe I will just focus on 2 or 3 that were particularly salient and maybe even painful for me. One can imagine that my favorite topic is not schools. I testified 17 times in front of Congress, and that was the major topic that I talked about, that was asked of me. I was a mom here in the Newton Public School District in March of 2020, and I actually called our mayor when we had our first 2 cases in Massachusetts to let her know, and to let her know that I thought she really needed to start thinking about closing our schools. I didn't know if that was going to be the right call or not, but I thought she should really start thinking about it. Over time, I worked in the community, I worked in the state, and I was asked by the mayor to come back and speak to the teachers of the Newton Public School System to talk about where we were and about safe ways to get back. And as it turns out, I did that conversation with another Newton Public School parent, Ashish Jha, who knew we would be in a different place at the same time. It was actually fascinating to have this conversation with the Newton Public Schools. Of course, it was all on Zoom. And the chat was read, "Are you paying for my funeral?" And many, many different comments like that. So the tension that I think, and in fact I certainly heard it while I was at CDC, of course, was we need to get our kids back to school. Of course we need to get our kids back to school, and school has to be safe. And then thinking about the disability community, which I heard a lot from, saying, how are you going to be sure this school is so essential for my disabled child, but if, any sort of virus could really tip them over and potentially even kill them. There was one other piece from school that I very vividly remember, from the schools that I vividly remember, and that was a moment that I was on the governor's reopening board here, Governor Baker's reopening board, and this was in the spring of 2020, and they were talking about getting the schools reopened actively. And the first thing that came up was the sports lobby, the after-school sports. Turns out it's a very active lobby, and we were hearing from the wrestlers. And of course, everybody knows you can't wrestle with a mask. So the plan was that they were going to take the masks off. This was spring of 2020. Wrestle only for 2 minutes rather than 3, because everybody knows the exposure is 3 minutes before you get COVID. and then at the end of this 2-minute match, separate to different sides of the bench, put your mask back on, and not share your water bottles. And all of us were thinking, and everybody sort of in this room is laughing and thinking that's kind of incredulous and not a great COVID plan. And that's kind of where we were all thinking. And then a parent raised her hand on the Zoom screen. And she said, my son is healthy, my family is healthy, and if my son doesn't wrestle next semester, he's not going to college. And then all of a sudden, health is just one thing at the table, and there are really other poignant, important considerations that when we are monocular on health and health alone, we are not considering for the long-term health of a society. And that was really poignant to me, and I think about it often. I thought about it often while I was at CDC and making decisions about, we're thinking so hard about health, what can't we otherwise see? Eric spoke a lot about Presti, and the bars were certainly Presti, the character who is the bar owner. As I read that chapter, I actually am spending the semester now at the American Academy of Berlin, and I'm one of my colleagues who was sitting at the dinner table with me said, you should be really reading this book for how you feel about it and the literary component, and I'm a scientist, not a literature person. So I started reading it through a little bit of a different lens, and I got mad. I'm sorry. And I thought, well, am I supposed to be sympathetic to this bar owner? Because how many times did I say the school should be open and the bars should be closed? And I don't want to be sympathetic, because the right thing to do at the time for society was that the bars should be closed. And so I was angry that any sympathy that Presti was getting in the moment, because quite honestly, what felt like was happening was that Presti was mad at the health officials because they were the ones saying the bars should be closed, when in fact it was society that was failing Presti. It was the economics that didn't allow him the sort of umbrella or the blanket to catch him, when in fact this was the right thing to do. But he was mad and targeting all of his hate towards the health system. So that made me a little angry about Presti. One reflection on youth. There was, as you talk about one of the kids in the book, you talk about how he said, "I'm actually having a pretty good pandemic," and some people actually did okay, right? I have 3 sons, and I remember my youngest actually he graduated in 2020, so he missed his graduation, he missed his prom, he missed his first year of college, and as many in here, some in here might have, and I sent him on a semester abroad to Switzerland because they were open. And we paid for a first-class ticket because nobody else was on the plane, and it was like a $150 ticket to go abroad. And we used to say he won the pandemic lottery, like he was having a great pandemic. And so some people did okay, and then some kids kind of didn't. And it was actually interesting if you're a parent and have friends who have kids anywhere in the range. You know, those 2-year-olds really didn't socialize, and by the time they got to kindergarten, they had a really hard time. Middle schoolers that's executive function is 6th and 7th grade. How you learn to go from 1 classroom to 7 classrooms and do homework. Like, you completely lost executive function if you missed COVID years in your middle school. And so watching this through my kids' lenses as they were in high school and 2 in college that really felt poignant to me. Maybe one last thing I will say before passing it over to Glenn, and that is anybody who does any work in infectious disease knows that infectious disease affect the vulnerable. When you think about who has tuberculosis, who has HIV, who has malaria. And so it was always interesting to me that COVID came to this country, SARS-CoV-2 came to this country on airplanes and cruise ships, people who could afford that kind of travel. And it really rapidly went to the most vulnerable populations. I remember being on CNN at one point, and they were talking about when the current president got COVID, and they were talking about all the famous people in the White House who they were worried who was infected in the Rose Garden and the Senate. And I thought to myself, and I said out loud actually on CNN, what about the butlers and the workers in the White House who are going home to multi-generational families, who when you say words like isolation and quarantine, you know they have no capacity to do what you're asking of them. This was a really helpful, insightful visit. I think it is really important for people to read it, to remember, to revisit. I will just leave you with sort of one really hard anecdote, and that is at Mass General, we were standing up ICUs every week. We had about 14 ICUs, I think, at the peak. Of course, there were no visitors. Things were closed. One of my son's friends from high school was in what was a fatal car accident. He was taken to the emergency room, then the ICU, and he had turned 18 the week before. And because he had turned 18, he was taken to the adult ICU rather than the pediatric ICU, which meant that his parents couldn't come in to say goodbye to him. And I got a phone call from somebody in the know and asked if I could have an intervention so his parents could come in to say goodbye. That was 2020. Thank you.
Glenn?
I'm going to echo a few things that Rochelle said. So one of the things is to say at the very beginning, this was a book that was incredibly well written, but incredibly difficult to read as well. And I think that, I had read historically the Spanish flu in popular culture, newspaper culture, and history. almost immediately after it happens, it is forgotten, it is suppressed, people don't talk about it, and it always puzzled me. And reading this book, I think, was actually enlightening about my own metacognition, because there were so many things I had forgotten or I had repressed about this time period, and I had to often stop reading the book just to I needed some time away from it because I remember this. At the start of the pandemic, the dean called me and said, we really need you to step into the administration, in part because you're a health law person, to become a deputy dean. And I remember the amount of decision-making under conditions of uncertainty and trying more, I would say, in 2021 when we were reopened than in 2020, but the need to kind of make a bunch of decisions in this respect. And publicly, week by week, I remember as a law professor, it was one of the busiest times of my life. My husband and our lives diverged. He was a documentary filmmaker. Everything stopped for him. And for me, everything went up and up and up in terms of what people needed me to do, whether it was 1 week vaccine passports, then interstate travel, religious freedom, digital contact tracing, wastewater measurement, intentional infection trials, ventilator reallocation. It was just a series of tough legal and ethical questions. With the book, I think there are 4 things that I was curious to talk to you about, so hopefully people will find this interesting as well. The first one, ironically, I circled the word uncertainty because that was one of the words that I was interested in. Sometimes the book engages this. I think there's a portion where you talk about Sheila Jasanoff's work on epistemic authority, but elsewhere I'm curious about your own views about decision-making under uncertainty. And I think some of the early chapters regarding the decision about whether to recommend masking or the like, in retrospect, quite a harsh judgment about history, about retaining it, and this question about transparency, uncertainty, and thinking a little bit about how policymakers have to make these decisions under conditions where the science is evolving, thinking about the way we sell science and we sold science during the pandemic as having the answer, rather than treating science as a method, as one that is often divergent in this sort of way. And I'm curious about your views about that. Second theme I think that I was interested in reading it was globalism versus localism. So the book, by its nature, its ethnography portions of it, it's hyperlocal. We're not even talking about a borough. We're often talking about a particular apartment building and the community that forms there. There are other moments where it's actually quite global, a lot of comparisons in particular to Australia and the UK, both data and also policy-wise. And I guess I was curious about the middle space, which was state deviation, because there's a way in which, we always teach students the Brandeisian laboratory of experiments, this idea that states are amazing opportunities to test out different policies. And COVID was actually a highly experimental setting in terms of the different states. And I spent part of the 2020 in Miami, helping to care for my parents, and part in Cambridge. I could not imagine 2 more divergent places to be. In Miami, there were raves. In Cambridge, what I would say, and this is, again, I don't know if you'll remember this too, this is such a specific thing. There was the Cambridge teddy bear scavenger hunt, which was essentially that people were encouraged to put teddy bears in their windows and dress them up so that children who were at home could be walking outside during winter especially, and there was a little bit of map for your neighborhood to find this, right? So we had a hyper compliant group of people here in Cambridge. We had, a government that was largely leading into protective measures. In Florida, we had a very different kind of approach. And just thinking a little bit about these differences and how they played out sociologically, whether they were reflections of pre-existing conditions in these places versus government leadership. Okay. Third thing, I was intrigued that none of the narratives were about medical professionals, because when I thought about New York during this time period, one of the abiding memories is the applause given at 4 o'clock every day at the changing of the shifts or what it was. And you talk a little bit about it when we talk about the nursing homes a little about midway through the book. But I was curious whether, and I know that the method was that many of these people were people you caught through other research you were already doing and the like, and narratives picked up. But I was curious about whether a narrative of what it was like to be an ID, an emergency room doctor and the like in this period of time, what we might have learned about that. Okay, and then the last one, again, I'm a law professor, so this is the case of everything, having a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? I was obsessed as a reader with the question about the role of law in this, and I couldn't really tell whether you believed the following was true. If the laws had been different or presented differently, the lived experience of the individuals you were centered on would have been different. I couldn't tell whether the book should be understood as a genre of what's sometimes called order without law, the idea that social sanctions, the idea of sub-communities forming in a building, for example, an apartment, were what made a difference about your experience of the pandemic, or whether you believe the legal structure and the legal decisions being made were really important this way. Maybe it was intentional, but I couldn't understand whether you thought that government overall had done as well as could be expected or was deeply a failure in the setting. And the Daniel Presti chapter, which I also focused on, this is I think, will probably be the most polarizing read for people. In a way, you present him both as incredibly sympathetic and incredibly alien at the same time, which is a very interesting mix. The best way for me to describe it is a little bit of a dated reference. Is there's an old Michael Douglas film called Falling Down about a person who's just an ordinary man who has too much and suddenly essentially becomes quite violent. And there's a way about reading this as a narrative about radicalization and how radicalization happens. But I guess I was curious about centering the one narrative that's really strongly about resistance on such a person who goes so far, whether you had thought about trying to bring in voices of people who were resisting but not resisting in the dramatic way that he had, and whether you think from their perspective. One last way of putting this is to say, if I imagine what our new HHS Secretary Kennedy, what he would make of reading this book and about the view, I was curious if you had thought about that as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to all of you. That's really amazing. So I'm just going to add one question, and then we'll go back to Eric, and then have each of you weigh in again. And the idea, I love that Rochelle shared that she read the Presti chapter and felt really mad, and that there's a way in which what Eric does so well is to render empathetic characters that are really different from who we are and who have very different views and different worldviews and outlooks on the same thing that we've lived through. And to me, that chapter was amazing for that. But you have to ask, what is the purpose of this, right? And I think that partly the mad reaction is like, why should I have these emotions of sympathy? And I think that what Eric, what you were getting at in your talk was that it's the only way we can actually understand how we got here, not just understand this person and this character, but also how we got here. Because I think that even just Glenn's story about the hyper-compliant Cambridge, Mass. Versus the very non-compliant Miami crowd, that's a story about intense division in how you see the government. And then the theme of trust versus distrust. You're talking about a community that truly trusts what the people in charge are telling you to do. We in Cambridge, Mass. Identify with and very much trust the authorities. That's what that storyteller says to me. Whereas the people in Florida did not trust the government and the policies that they were saying would be good for you. And that division of trust and distrust really maps onto exactly how, I think that that's what you were saying, Eric, that this is part of the story of how we got here to this place. And so maybe I'm being too presentist, but I think this talk also is about 2025, and that 2020 was a key year, possibly the key year, in creating the conditions that got us here, where, as you say, the distrust people are now the ones in charge.
Well, thanks to all three of you. Those are incredibly insightful and really very moving responses. And it's kind of hard to, I kind of grapple with the emotional and, existential register of that, where you left us. And I have a lot that, I had some personal stories that were in that vein, as probably many of us did. I lost a family member, very close family member of COVID. And in the beginning of the book, I write about our very early experience in the beginning of March, where I came home and my son, who was like this engine of like physical ferocity, soccer player, never stops, was just like wiped out with a huge fever, couldn't get off his bed and for a long time. and nobody knew who was going to be affected. It was so early. We didn't know who was going to live and who was going to die. And all I knew is like he was my responsibility. And also, I was never going to take him to the hospital in New York City. Absolutely not going to do that. And it was terrifying. I mean, if you're a parent, like, and you find yourself in that situation, you just don't know what to do. It's terrifying. And maybe that's like one reason why I felt like I had to write this book. I found myself like lying in bed just with my brain spinning all over the place. And actually, many people have asked, like, why did you condemn yourself to live COVID for 4 years so intensely? But you both noted, as many people have, that the book is hard in some way. And I will own up to that. It's weird for me to look at people reading books about the Holocaust saying, like, this COVID book is really hard, I'm not going to read it. But I get that. It's hard, and I guess I'll start there. I recognize it's a big ask, to tell you to go back to 2020 and go through what happened and to try to pick up these things that you experienced but you've repressed or just couldn't take in because, again, so much happened at such incredible velocity. Like we couldn't process it all. Like we had to block it out. But I think we have to. I think we have to because it's in us and it's acting out, which is kind of Jeannie's last point. It's like I think we're still in 2020 in some fundamental ways. I strongly believe that 2024's election was the energy of it, the anger, the frustration. That was the stuff that got whipped up in 2020. Of course. I was alive in 2019 also, and I know that we were divided and distrustful and angry, and we had enemies. But it got to a level in 2020 that I think it hasn't been at before, and the data show that. And I think we're trapped there, and the rhetoric of 2024 is still there. Okay, let me try to get into some of the specific things, and I'll try to combine a few of them. First, the uncertainty thing. It's a big theme of the book, and it's important because for those of you who, if you're not steeped in this kind of conversation in the literature, there's a distinction between risk, where we have a lot of past information, we have data, and we can think about the probabilities of different kinds of things happening. We can make a risk assessment, and there's fields of risk assessment, like actuaries do that for insurance companies, and we want to know how much you should pay for your property insurance if you live in Pacific Palisades, and or New Orleans, and we have these models. But then there are some things like we don't have data for. There's just uncertainty. So now we have this global warming thing happening, although you might not see data on it for a while from this country. So now it's just different. We don't know exactly what's the likelihood of a mega fire in this area of Los Angeles, or is it a 1 in 100 year storm, or 1 in 500 year storm, or a 1 in 10 year storm? And that matters for insurance pricing. And so it's, as Rochelle will tell you, it's one thing to make decisions and policies under conditions of risk. It's another thing in conditions of uncertainty. So there's a medical anthropologist whose work I like a lot, there's Sheila, and there's also a guy named Andrew Lakoff who writes about kind of vital systems management, and he talks about the use of the precautionary principle. And the precautionary principle says, when you can default to something that is slightly more protective, you want to understand what the risks are, but that might be a better play. And so here we get into some really interesting stuff about trade-offs, which I think comes out a little bit in your comments when you start talking about Presti and what to do, and I think I see it a little bit in your comments as well. So there's a new book coming out soon from two Princeton political scientists called In COVID's Wake, and it's a kind of an attack on the regime that was in charge of epidemiology and public health in the United States, including my panelist to my left, and Anthony Fauci and Francis Collins, the whole kind of health leadership of the United States. And it's odd. I mean, remember, at least in 2020, these were the health leaders that came from the Trump administration, and this is going to get to your law point. But the claim is first. I mean, the thing I don't like about the book is there's a claim that really the health leaders were running the American policy response. And my recollection is that we did have a president in 2020, and that there was an administration that was actually making the decisions about what policies to do at the federal level. And then there were lots of states, and there's lots of variation. And that actually, had Fauci been running the country, we probably would have had a really different kind of response. And I'll keep back to that. But the trade-off point is the whole thing about public health, which I feel like we don't talk about enough, is that public health is a hybrid field, and hybrid is too narrow a term. And the role of government in a health crisis is precisely to think about those various trade-offs, right? Like if you're gonna be protective and try to do something around a health issue, then what does it mean for kids learning? And what does it mean for the economy? What does it mean for employment? Down the line. I don't think it's right to ask the epidemiologists to make those trade-off kinds of decisions. That's what we look to the higher levels of government for. And I think the mistake of this Princeton book that none of you have read, because it's not out yet, is to miss that. But there is a point that I think is worth us thinking about, and that is I don't think we knew how to talk about the trade-offs in a very open way in 2020. And one could make the claim that our policies seem motivated by the project of protecting life above all other things, even precarious life, the life of older people, the life of frail people, right? And I'm not saying that's a right or wrong thing, but we didn't really have a big, robust debate about it, about what the trade-offs would be for Danny Presti or for kids in school, mothers, down the line. Okay, so trade-offs thing. Now, one last thing on law, just because it's important. I think the argument in the book is this was much worse than it should have been here in the United States. And it is precisely because policy seemed like it was driven by this effort to protect life. But in fact, what we got from the White House, and that trickled through the system even into the states, was incredible chaos, dysregulation, inconsistency, that made it very difficult for anyone to really follow what we should do. And it gets really highlighted around masks, but there's other issues where it comes up as well. And so our policies were all over the place, and it created a space for the kind of dissent from state to state.
So some students do have class at 1:30, but we will go to 1:30, and so that's why some people will be leaving. Right. But I wanted to give people in the audience a chance to ask some questions in the remaining time. So,
folks want to come up to the...
Yeah, please come up to the mic.
Thank you so much for your time. I'm very interested in what you had to say about essential workers, particularly because a lot of those essential workers were lower wage, and that many of them, had some feelings of radicalization following COVID about not trusting government as much. I'm curious how you feel this may or may not apply to mobilization, both on the Hill and among the population around Medicaid cuts, because that's a population that would probably be disproportionately impacted by Medicaid cuts. It's a population that had their health care really threatened based on government action. And additionally, because Medicaid is sort of the last resort for long-term care, like people with long COVID might need, I'm just curious how you see potential opportunities for mobilization or real points of disconnection.
Yeah, well, I might let others speak to this also. I mean, I'm enough of an empirical social scientist to say I didn't study that particular group to know about it, but I do think that a lot of people experienced a level of both vulnerability and frustration with the nature of delivery of services that they got from government, that they became mobilizable. And in the book, the conversation around mobilizing has two focal points. One is around the movement for Black Lives and the whole kind of debate about racial justice, but the other is around the emergence of mutual aid networks at the very local level, which I think is an enormous. There's an optimistic part of the book for those of you who are looking for a smiley takeaway on RFK Day, RFK Jr. Day. There is really a story about local organizing around mutual aid that I think is worth paying attention to. So I don't know if another panelist wants to speak about this specific issue, but I can't give you what you want, unfortunately.
I'll just give you bad news, which is to say we made a bunch of decisions about S-chip, about getting people enrolled, that incredibly increased access and the safety net, and was incredibly cost-effective and effective. And then we just decided not to continue. Congress couldn't get its act together to continue that. So my own view is that when it comes to these social safety net programs, they're on the chopping block.
Would you please come up to the mic? Thank you.
So great panel. Thank you. Can you hear me now?
Just get closer to the mic. I
Yeah.
think.
Okay. Great. This is a question specifically for Eric. Oh, there we go. I'm not usually on stage, so something that I thought was interesting that kept coming up through this talk was this will to move on, institutions moving on, people moving on, and so I'm wondering, as a sociologist, speaking from one to another, where do you think that will comes from? And is that uniquely an American thing? Did other countries move on? Are they still grappling? One thing I found interesting is we don't really have rituals around COVID in the way that we do about 9/11 or acute events. We have ways that we can mourn it and remember it. COVID, I went to a COVID party recently to remember it, and that was a very weird thing. Wow. And so I was just wondering if you could talk more about that will.
Yeah, so party seems like the wrong way to commemorate COVID, but
Yeah, that was the irony.
We can go there later, yeah. I don't think the will not to know is distinctively American, but I do think that there are some distinctively American ways in which we try to move on and soldier forward. I think that this is a traumatic event, and I think, like a lot of traumatic events, it's nicer to put it in a black box and put it in the closet where you don't have to deal with it. And I think, this comment that is so interesting the way you put this, you've read about this kind of will not to know in other cases. There's a historiographical literature on why America forgot the pandemic of 1918 and 1990. And it's true, I am startled by the extent to which COVID has disappeared from the public discourse. I think the specifically American thing is that we do like stories about ourselves in which we come out great. And I don't think there's any viable way you can tell that story about the US. Or maybe the two achievements are Operation Warp Speed and the vaccines. And then there's a funny afterlife around it. And the economic recovery afterwards is an extraordinary achievement, that no nation in Europe can come close to. And it's just fascinating to me that voters didn't feel that. So our experience with the economy, right, this vibe session idea, is decoupled from what the numbers tell us, which I think is a really puzzling thing. But I would invite you to do more work on this, fellow sociologists, because I think it's really important. Yeah.
One thing I think is really important in terms of the will not to know and the need to it's not to relive the pain. It's not necessarily, and we can do that, but we have to be better for the next time. And if we're not making the investments that we need to make in order to be better for the next time, because we're not talking about it in all the places that when I was at CDC, we were receiving COVID data by fax. That's totally unacceptable. It's you think it's funny, but I'm trying to make decisions under uncertainty, and there are data out there where I can make a better decision, and I don't have them at my fingertips. And so, we do need to make these investments. You spoke about avian flu. The authorities that CDC had, when people say we are under testing, CDC does not have the authority to test. The agency is not allowed to go into a farm and test workers or test cattle. So, these things, if we don't go back and remember and understand where some of these things were challenging, then we are destined to repeat them.
Thanks so much for being here. This was really great. Professor Klinenberg, I'm most familiar with your other work around social infrastructure and community. And it feels like COVID was a really salient turning point for that whole world, and it really revealed the just foundations of disconnection in our society. And since then, there's been a resurgence in communitarianism and thinking about public infrastructure, which I've been involved in. And I'm wondering how you see those two elements of your work intersecting and what COVID means for that.
Yeah, so thank you for that. I wrote a book a few years ago called Palaces for the People about this idea that there's a social infrastructure that supports, undergirds our civic life, and that it's in these physical places. And if we let them get neglected or we stop investing in them, we have all these really negative consequences, isolation, detachment. The social bonds start to come undone. And so I think what was powerful about COVID, of course, is the public realm was emptied. Right? We didn't have access to those places. And the context of this whole story, which is about division and distrust and ideology really emerging, takes place in the vacuum that Jeannie started us off talking about. In those kinds of conditions, it is much easier to grow spiteful and distrustful and angry. And there is something about the physical encounter with other people, which, if you do it in the right conditions over time, can help you recognize our common humanity. Right? I mean, it doesn't always do that. Sometimes you go down to take the subway and you just get angry at other people. But if you build a public realm in such a way that it encourages a better kind of civic participation, that you're establishing the building blocks for a democratic society. And I guess I hate to have such low goals, but at the moment it feels to me like if we could get to the point where we could recognize our common humanity and dignity, that would be an advance over where the public conversation is right now. So I'm very concerned about the attack on those public institutions. I'm paying a lot of attention to the attack on libraries right now, which were never partisan in the way that they've become, never became supercharged. But look, I think one of the features of anti-democratic societies is they want to go after gathering places that support civic life and that give people some capacity to have access knowledge and build off their ideas. And I think at this moment, where I'm landing for the next several years in American life is, I'm concerned about our access to knowledge. I really genuinely fear that just as Trump said, I'm not going to let the people off the cruise ship and come onto land because I like the numbers where they are. And just as governors didn't want to release data on mortality in nursing homes, that if there's some new crisis, the health leadership in this country, or the climate leadership, or the labor leadership won't want the numbers to come out. I'm worried about that. And I'm worried about our capacity to take hold of the public realm and to gather and to express ourselves collectively. And those are things I think all of us need to be keeping an eye on for many years to come.
I think with that, we're going to thank you so much, and thank you all for participating in this important conversation. Thank you.